Have you ever wondered how greed can turn people into monsters? Imagine a tribe that once wandered in poverty, suddenly rising to unimaginable wealth, making the world gasp in astonishment. This was the Osage people. But when their riches attracted greedy eyes lurking in the shadows, could justice still stand firm in a world overflowing with corruption? This is the story of the miraculous, yet tragic transformation of the Osage, a haunting reminder that in the hands of human greed, even the greatest blessings can turn into a dark curse. The systematic murders of the Osage people were not random acts of violence, but rather a well-orchestrated scheme designed to strip them of their wealth. The victims were primarily wealthy Osage individuals who owned head rights, legal entitlements to oil profits that had made them incredibly rich. These individuals were targeted in multiple ways, often by those closest to them: spouses, guardians, business partners, and even so-called friends. The methods of murder were shockingly varied and brutally calculated. Many Osage were shot in cold blood, gunned down in their own homes as they slept or ambushed on lonely roads. Their bodies were left to rot in the wilderness, discarded like hunted animals or dumped into ravines, their deaths barely investigated. Poisoning was another insidious tactic. Killers laced food, drinks, or even medicine with slow-acting toxins, condemning their victims to agonizing deaths. Some Osage suffered for weeks, their bodies wasting away, their skin turning pale, their breaths growing weaker. Doctors, often accomplices in these crimes, dismissed their deaths as natural illnesses, sealing their fate with a falsified diagnosis. But perhaps the most horrifying method was the use of explosives. One of the most infamous atrocities occurred in 1923, when an entire house was rigged with dynamite. In the dead of night, the blast tore through the home, obliterating everything inside. The explosion was so powerful that it sent body parts flying, scattering charred remains among the burning wreckage. An entire family was wiped out in an instant, their lives snuffed out in a fireball of destruction. Neighbors, awakened by the deafening blast, ran to the scene only to be met with the harrowing sight of smoldering ruins and the anguished screams of those who had lost loved ones. Many of these deaths were initially ruled as accidents, suicides, or natural causes, allowing the murderers to evade suspicion and legally inherit their victims' wealth. The corruption ran deep, enabling these killers to walk free while the Osage people continued to die, their numbers dwindling in a silent, calculated genocide. What made the situation even more terrifying was the level of complicity among local authorities. Many law enforcement officers turned a blind eye to these crimes, either out of racial bias or because they were paid off by the perpetrators. Corruption ran so deep that some doctors even falsified death certificates, ensuring that no proper investigations would be conducted. The estimated number of victims remains uncertain, with historians suggesting that the death toll could be in the hundreds. Each death not only robbed the Osage of their loved ones, but also weakened their community, pushing them into a state of constant fear and paranoia. The killings went unchecked for years, with many Osage living in terror, knowing they could be next. The sudden and overwhelming wealth of the Osage was the primary reason they became targets of a brutal campaign of greed and violence. In the late 19th century, when oil was discovered beneath their land, the Osage had the rare fortune of retaining mineral rights to their territory. This meant that instead of being forced off their land, as many other Native American tribes had been, they were able to lease the drilling rights to oil companies and collect massive profits. Each Osage tribal member, regardless of their personal land ownership, received a share of these profits, known as head rights. These head rights were not only incredibly lucrative, but also hereditary, meaning they could be passed down to heirs. As a result, Osage individuals, including women and children, found themselves among the wealthiest people in the United States. However, this wealth came at a cost. The wealth of the Osage was not just light, it was also darkness. From 1918 to 1931, a wave of mysterious deaths swept through the tribe. Some were shot in the dead of night. Some unknowingly drank poisoned liquor, while others were torn apart in staged explosions. Some simply withered away without any clear cause. Dozens, possibly even hundreds, of Osage people fell simply because they held the rights to oil-rich land. Take the story of Molly Burkhart, a typical Osage woman. Her sister, Anna Brown, was shot dead in 1921. Her body left cold in a ravine. Their mother gradually wasted away, suspected of being poisoned over time. Another sister, Rita Smith, along with her husband and their servant, was blown to pieces in a house explosion in 1923. All of them were owners or heirs to oil rights. When they died, their wealth quietly transferred into the hands of others, often white men, like Ernest Burkhart, Molly's husband, who was later revealed to be a key player in the conspiracy. Behind these deaths stood William King Hale, a man who called himself a friend of the Osage. From his vast ranch, he orchestrated a web of death, commanding hitmen and arranging marriages to seize wealth. His nephew, Ernest, married Molly and became complicit in the bloodshed of her family. This was no random killing spree, but a calculated, ruthless scheme designed to drain every drop of black gold from the hands of the Osage. Osage wealth, derived from oil rights, made them some of the richest people in America. They lived in luxury but faced deep resentment, as their prosperity challenged the racial hierarchy of the time. As the number of mysterious deaths continued to rise, the Osage sought outside help. Frustrated by the lack of action from local authorities, they petitioned the federal government to intervene. Their cries for justice reached the newly established Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, led by a young J. Edgar Hoover. Determined to prove the efficiency of his agency, Hoover assigned a team of undercover agents, led by former Texas Ranger Tom White, to investigate the murders. The FBI agents infiltrated the community, posing as various professionals, ranchers, businessmen, and even medical personnel to gather information discreetly. Through patient and methodical detective work, the FBI uncovered a vast conspiracy centered around William King Hale, a powerful and well-respected cattleman who had positioned himself as a friend to the Osage. In reality, Hale was the mastermind behind a scheme that involved manipulating Osage wealth through marriage and murder. He and his accomplices, including his own nephew, Ernest Burkhart, had orchestrated multiple killings to consolidate control over Osage head rights. With solid evidence in hand, the FBI arrested Hale and his co-conspirators, leading to one of the first major cases that established the credibility of the FBI. Although Hale was eventually convicted and sentenced to life in prison, many other perpetrators went unpunished, leaving a lasting wound on the Osage community. The Osage Massacre remains one of the darkest chapters in American history, highlighting the devastating consequences of unchecked greed and systemic racism. While some justice was served, the trauma inflicted on the Osage people endured for generations. Many Osage descendants continue to fight for recognition and reparations, ensuring that the crimes committed against their ancestors are never forgotten. The case also led to reforms in the guardianship system, though Native American communities continue to face economic and legal challenges to this day. Beyond legal and financial impacts, the massacre left deep emotional scars. Families were torn apart, cultural traditions were disrupted, and an entire generation lived under the shadow of fear and betrayal. The Osage people were forced to reckon with the painful truth that their prosperity had made them targets, and that the very system meant to protect them had, instead, facilitated their exploitation. Today, the Osage Nation continues to thrive, but the memory of the massacre serves as a stark reminder of the injustices they faced. Their story is not just a tale of tragedy, but also one of resilience, a testament to a people who refuse to be erased by history. The Osage Murders reveal the deadly cost of greed and racism. Their story, both tragic and resilient, must be remembered to prevent history from repeating itself.